Good evening and welcome to tonight's season finale of the Fourscore Speaker Series. My name is Phyllis Evans and I am the Senior Director of Development for the Abraham Lincoln Presidential Library Foundation. Before we introduce tonight's guests, I'd like to thank each of you for joining us this evening. We have been honored during this series to host some amazing historians, authors, historical interpreters, and tonight you are in for a great collaboration with our CEO, Aaron Carlson Mast, Adjunct Professor at American University in DC, Curtis Harris, and some very special guests from Juneteenth Incorporated and the Illinois State Museum. As always, we will entertain questions from the audience, so please type those below in the Q&A box and we will get to as many as we can. And now, without further ado, please help me in welcoming our Foundation President and CEO, Aaron Carlson Mast.
Thank you, Phyllis, and thanks everyone for joining us this evening for the season finale of our Fourscore Speaker Series. We're delighted to be joined by featured speaker Curtis M. Harris in Washington, D.C., who will share the history of Juneteenth and emancipation in America, and by special guests from Juneteenth Incorporated in the Illinois State Museum, both based in Springfield, Illinois. Juneteenth is today the most common name for the holiday commemorating June 19, 1865, the day General Gordon Granger of the Union Army, having taken up headquarters in Galveston, Texas, read aloud General Order No. 3, formally transmitting the news of the Emancipation Proclamation, which Lincoln had signed 2.5 years prior. Juneteenth is neither the only nor the first holiday celebrating or commemorating emancipation, but it has spread nationally, including very recently as a holiday, and we look forward to delving into that with Curtis Harris. But first, I'm excited to welcome our special guests from Juneteenth Incorporated and the Illinois State Museum, who will share the importance of commemorating this day in Springfield and the state of Illinois and other opportunities for you to enjoy leading up to and on June 19th, 2021. So first, I'd like to introduce our guests, Shamika Gregory and Erica Austin from Juneteenth Incorporated. They're leading the growth and continuation of what has been a 27-year public tradition of celebrating Juneteenth in Springfield, Illinois. Ladies, thank you for joining us this evening. And if Sharina Douglas has joined too, there she is. Excellent. Thank you so much, Sharina, for joining us. Please tell us about this tradition in Springfield and what people can look forward to this year.
Well, thank you first for the opportunity to be here today. And thank you for your support of Juneteenth throughout the year. As you stated, legislation in Illinois making June 19th a paid day off for all state employees and a social holiday was unanimously approved by the Illinois House and the Senate last month, and so it's on its way to the governor's desk to sign. Juneteenth, also known as Freedom Day, Jubilee Day, Liberation Day, is a monumental moment for African Americans in the United States. And you gave a brief history, was going to reiterate that. On June 19th, 1865, Union Army General Gordon Granger's reading of the federal orders in the city of Galveston, Texas, proclaimed all slaves in Texas now were free. The news of the emancipation, freeing the slaves by the President Lincoln, took 2 years to reach Texans. And by that time, President Lincoln had passed away, and the 13th Amendment, which had abolished slavery, had passed Congress. So even though the slaves were free, many plantation owners wanted them to stay until after the harvest. So they encouraged them to stay on as hired employees, therefore showing the injustice between the people in power and those who work for them. So during the last few years, Juneteenth has taken on a greater significance with all of the high-profile killings and other incidents involving African Americans from all ages and economic backgrounds. The Black Lives Matter protests all over the United States and the world brings to the forefront the need for racial justice, reforms in police policy, and procedures and changes in legislation that particularly affect disadvantaged people of color. So in Springfield, Illinois, we have been celebrating this since 1994. So about 27 years we have been celebrating this holiday and celebrating this celebration. And Shamika is going to tell you what we have to offer this year. And hope that you all will join us in our celebration.
So this year, instead of our normal 2-day event, we will have a 4-day event. Thursday, we will team up with the Levitt Series concert, and that will be on the Y Block. Friday, we have our public speaking meeting, and that will be 6 o'clock. We also have an exhibit with the Illinois State Museum that is now open to the public to see Monday through Saturday. Saturday and Sunday, we have a parade Saturday morning at 10, and following will be our celebration in the park. We have a gospel series, we have a blues fest, we have lots of vendors and activities for kids.
So it's going to be a really, really great event that we're happy that we have been asked to continue to charge for the celebration to bring awareness out about Juneteenth. And as Sharina likes to say, it's not just a party, a backyard party or barbecue in the park. We are actually celebrating our freedom. So we seek the support of our community leaders, our community partners, our stakeholders, and even constituents to recognize the past, reimagine the present, and realize our future. Springfield has much to be proud of and a rich history that we must celebrate and never forget. And so we want you all to come out one day or even 4 days to help us celebrate what Juneteenth is in Springfield, Illinois. So thank you for having us today.
Thank you so much to all of our friends from Juneteenth Incorporated. It's great to hear that over the last 27 years of you all commemorating this, it's only grown and gained more attention every single year. And including this year, you mentioned the partnership with the Illinois State Museum. So I'd like to now introduce Cinnamon Catlin Legetko, who's the director of the Illinois State Museum, which is committed to telling the story of Illinois, its people and places. The State Museum has a broad focus on art, history, and science represented in their collections, exhibits, research, and programs. Cinnamon, thanks for joining us this evening. Please tell us about what the State Museum has launched for Juneteenth this year.
Well, thank you, Erin, and hello, friends. It's so great to be with you. This is an incredible partnership that the Illinois State Museum is truly honored to be part of. I just joined the museum in the fall of 2019. So in the midst of COVID and all the intensity and sadness and upheaval of last year, I am so proud that we came together with Juneteenth Inc. to form where we are now. And thank you to the foundation for hosting this event tonight. We are grateful. So over Memorial Day weekend, just a few days ago, we opened 3 exhibits. 2 of them are in partnership with Juneteenth, which you just heard about, and one is just perfectly timed to open at this time, and all 3 focus on Black history and creativity. Noir is co-curated by Michelle Smith and Corbin King, who are both born and raised in Springfield, accomplished artists, and they curated a show of 20 talented artists featuring 33 pieces of art celebrating Black lives, past, present, and future. Noir is extraordinary. It is so beautiful. I am moved every time I walk into the space. It's a conversation, and it was really made possible because of this partnership. And I hope we can do it every year. We are in the process of selecting are awarding prizes, if you will, for this experience. It will be a ribboned art show, and we'll be announcing all of that information next week, who the top contenders are in Noir. And then also we opened Free-ish, which was co-written by Juneteenth's own Sharina and Shamika. They were our curators for that history show, which is installed on the front of our building. So you don't have any excuse not to see that show. It's right there on the front of the building and detailing the history of Juneteenth, of course, but also the deep pains and legacies of slavery all the way back to 1619. And what is now the United States of America. We also made those files available to other institutions, so you'll see them popping up across town, and we'll be doing a pop-up version of Free-ish that we'll take with us to the Juneteenth event. We'll be there on June 19th. We'll have an Illinois State Museum booth, and you can come see the exhibit there as well. And then I have to just mention this 3rd show, Ancestral Threads, which features the work of Sharice Wright, who is an African-American fiber artist who has unfortunately passed and expressed her creativity and her storytelling through quilts works. And it is just a beautiful textile show. All 3 opened on Memorial Day weekend, and you gotta hurry up and come see it because it's only gonna be up for a few weeks. We are free, we are open Tuesday through Saturdays right now, 10 to 4. There are no obstacles for you to stay away. So thank you for asking me to be here tonight, and I cannot wait to hear the presentation tonight. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Cinnamon. And we're going to provide for everyone in our audience tonight links to find the Juneteenth Inc. celebration Facebook page and the Illinois State Museum page. If the obstacle is that you don't live in Illinois or the Springfield area, you can at least learn more about these great things and potentially connect with other opportunities in your area too. And now it's my pleasure to welcome our featured speaker, Curtis Harris. I have had the pleasure of knowing Curtis for many years when he was on staff at President Lincoln's Cottage in DC, where I was the CEO prior to joining the foundation. The cottage is located at the Soldiers' Home in Washington, DC, where Lincoln was living while drafting the Emancipation Proclamation in the summer of 1862. As a public historian, Curtis has had countless conversations with people from DC and around the world about the history of emancipation and what it all means to the ongoing fight for freedom and equality today. Curtis is an adjunct professor and PhD history candidate at American University, whose research has focused on the struggle for rights in the United States. His dissertation, which he will be defending next month, folks, examines and explains the efforts of professional basketball players in the mid-20th century to secure their civil and labor rights. Since 2012, Curtis has also managed Pro Hoops History, an independent blog and newsletter focused on exploring the history and complexities of professional basketball in North America. Curtis's academic research has been presented at the North American Society for Sports History. His popular work on basketball history has appeared at ESPN, Bleacher Report, Sporting News, and NPR, and his time as a public historian has included work not only at President Lincoln's Cottage, but also the National Museum of American History, the National Museum of African American History and Culture, and the Philadelphia 76ers. Curtis holds a BA in International Studies from American University and an MA in Public History from American University, and very soon that PhD. Curtis, welcome. To kick things off, tell us what drew you to a career in history and public history and to devote your dissertation to the struggle for rights in the United States.
Well, I probably have to say, well, I've always been a lover of history as a child. So my mom was supposed to be attending this tonight digitally. So that's why I put the Al Green album up here behind me. So anyway, so she's the one that got me started on lots of interesting academic endeavors. So history was one of them. But why I chose to kind of, I guess, make it a career was actually, working at the cottage, because started working there in 2009 during the the wonderful Great Recession. So I was looking for any old job, but started working at the cottage, basically in the museum store there. I got opportunities to become a tour guide, and I just kind of looked around. I was like, okay, being able to interact with people, tell them about history, answer their questions, and just that thought process was really engaging for me. So I went back and got the public history master's, and now working on the PhD. And through talking about the Emancipation Proclamation and just knowing that that was a really important story, but like it's part of a much, much larger story. That's why I start to focus on what does it mean to have certain rights in the United States, who gets these rights, who doesn't get those rights, who decides who gets these rights. So those are kind of questions I've been kind of asking. And since I love basketball, that's why my dissertation is on that, kind of, merge the two things that I really enjoy, but I've done lots of other work in other areas, but the dissertation is on basketball since, that's my favorite thing in the world besides music, probably.
And the Civil War.
Yes.
Yeah.
At least the results of the Civil War.
That's true. There you go. So June 19th, 1865, as was mentioned in the introduction here, was about 2.5 years after the Emancipation Proclamation, and it was also a little over 2 months after the surrender at Appomattox on April 9th, 1865. And for many years, Juneteenth was an anniversary that was really marked more in Texas or the region, not so much nationally as we're seeing happen today. You're a 7th generation Texan. You're from the Galveston area, but going further back, your ancestors were forced there from other parts of the South. So I'm going to start with a Texas-sized question for you. What was the trajectory of slavery in Texas leading up to the Civil War?
It's actually, it's an example I've used quite often with people to show them that, well, let me back up a second, because oftentimes people will kind of have this idea, but kind of a false notion that slavery was dying out on its own and that it would kind of just wither away. I mean, even people in that era, Abraham Lincoln among them, kind of had this idea, and Thomas Jefferson before him, they're just like, well, slavery would just slowly die out on the vine. Like, it's like, no. So if you go like to let's say like 1820, 1821, when Mexico got its independence from Spain. There was practically no enslaved person in Texas, which of course was part of Mexico at that point. But by the Civil War, you're talking about a third almost of the population was now enslaved. So clearly something is happening, whereas, slavery is not naturally dying out. It's actually proactively being brought to this territory, this region that did not have slavery in any meaningful fashion prior to the 1820s and 1830s. So, and my ancestors were part of that, fortunately, part of that drive to propel slavery in this new region to grow cotton, make money. So basically like a boom town or boom state, the slavery and cotton business at that point.
Yeah. So why did Granger choose Galveston? What was the impact of him, and what was the impact of him transmitting the notice of emancipation to those enslaved, not just in Galveston, but also throughout Texas? Because he's doing this from like the balcony of a house, so there's going to be a limited audience there. So why Galveston, and what was the impact of that?
Well, Galveston was really the most important city in Texas until the hurricane hit, like around 1900. So Galveston was the largest city. It was the port city. So going back to the cotton, people would grow the cotton in East Texas and going out towards Central Texas. They'll bring the cotton basically to Galveston for export to New Orleans, and then across the Atlantic to England ultimately. But for that reason, Galveston being the major port and largest city, it was really important during the Civil War. So the U.S. Army and Navy actually did occupy Galveston for, I think, about 6 months in 1862. From that summer, ironically, until New Year's Day, 1863, which is when Abraham Lincoln signs the Emancipation Proclamation at the White House. So this is one of the, again, like just terribly ironic for the folks in Texas who were enslaved. But the day Lincoln signs his order, that, I guess officially begins like mass emancipation in the U.S. The Confederates were able to successfully dislodge the U.S. Army from Galveston. So yeah, that was the last time the U.S. Army was in Texas until June 19th, 1865. And again, they choose Galveston because basically Galveston is the place to be, because it is the port. If you want to kind of fan out to the wider region, that's where you get your supplies and all that good stuff. So it kind of just made sense, to make the announcement at Galveston. Again, that's the major city. But as you noted, like you're making this announcement to a crowd outside this house. Well, saying the words isn't going to magically go from Galveston to Houston, which is fairly close, but that's still not automatically going to get to Houston, let alone San Antonio, Fort Worth, Austin, these other cities in Texas at that point, and obviously the farmland in between those areas. So yeah, they had their work cut out for them over the next few weeks and months to actually make good on this word, which is not surprising given the fact that Lincoln signs the proclamation 2.5 years earlier, yet here we are 2.5 years later, still enforcing their proclamation. So it shouldn't be surprising that it would take several more weeks and months to fulfill the Juneteenth order.
Yeah. And that's, I mean, when you refer to that, you're really talking about the Union Army there, right? Because maybe explain a little bit more, the Emancipation Proclamation, I think there are so many logistics sort of embedded in that document of things that are going to happen. If that's when you compare it to a document like the Gettysburg Address, that's meant to be sort of more poetic, and it's outlining a vision. With the Emancipation Proclamation, you're really getting into something that has logistical needs tied to it, and the Union that way. Can you talk a little bit about how the Union Army had their work cut out for them when it came to the Emancipation Proclamation?
This was a big thing, when we would work at the college and tell people about the proclamation, like they just think, oh, it's some great words, and they think in a snap everything happens. It's like, no, it's a military order, so with it comes all the military logistics. So who's going to free these people? How are you going to get word to those folks once they're free? How do you care for them? Like, where do they get food and shelter and all that? Then of course, the people who have been enslaved, didn't need Lincoln to tell them that they ought to be free. So they had been trying to seize their own freedom for the previous 2 years of the war. So these questions had already been coming up, but they just become, more important, I suppose, in a certain way, since the federal government's officially behind this effort. So it was an enormous undertaking to now have the US military be in the business of not just defeating the rebel army, but now also liberating any enslaved person they come across. Like that's the official order. So if you defy the order, basically just defying a military order, so you risk court martial or execution, I guess, at the ultimate end of the day. So that did get if there were some recalcitrant Union troops, they got in line once the president told them you got to free these people. But the logistical challenge is enormous. Like you got to think about how enormous the southern states were. So I think something that might make it more real for people is when you think about General Sherman's march through Georgia. Like when he goes through Georgia, he's not just fighting whatever Confederate army he comes across. As his army marches from Atlanta to Savannah, all along that way, there are Black people joining up with the military, whether to try to be soldiers themselves or just trying to be free and not be re-enslaved once the army goes. Because that's another big point, is Sherman is marching through Georgia. He doesn't stop. So if you see that those blue uniforms going through and you're a slave, you're thinking like, okay, this is like my 30 minutes to kind of hop on. Otherwise, I might still be enslaved for who knows how long afterwards. Because, the Union's winning the war at that point, but nothing is guaranteed. So this is the best guarantee you guys to join up with Sherman at that point. So I think that's a real good concrete way to think about it. And now kind of translate that situation to Texas in the summer of 1865, where there's no more military hostilities, but the US Army still has to go out throughout the state to actually inform the people and enforce the Emancipation Order. So yeah, just think about, the food, the weapons, just the federal marshal, because it's not just the army at that point, it's also like federal officials. So like federal marshals, the judicial system, people having to work out the labor contracts that I mentioned earlier by Erica and Shamika, just like, this new order has to be instilled or imposed upon the old order of slavery. So like, it's just a whole lot of chaos going on throughout all this, throughout the rest of 65 and into 1866.
Yeah. Yeah, and you brought up a point that, there are a lot of wide-ranging views on what the Emancipation Proclamation did do and what it didn't do, but it did do more than make a declaration of emancipation. It included the opportunity, as it were, for military service, as you mentioned. So what was the impact of that?
Yeah, that was tremendous because as I mentioned, Black folks, even before the Civil War, obviously, the famous Harriet Tubman, Frederick Douglass, they, again, didn't need somebody to tell them, hey, you should be free. They were like, okay, I should be free. Where's my opportunity to get it? And then it's pretty dangerous too. So I don't want to discount that for folks who didn't take that opportunity. It isn't because they didn't want to be free. It's like, it's dangerous to try to get that freedom. So that's something to just keep in mind. But with the proclamation, President Lincoln, on the one hand, or just kind of three pillars here. One, as I mentioned, he ordered the military, you have to free these folks when you come across them. You can't turn these people away. Number two, he did authorize the official recruitment of Black soldiers into the US military. So the US colored troops, they were called. So those folks, those men who signed up at, I'm not going to remember the exact date, but sometime in 1864, Congress did pass a law to supplement the proclamation that said that the family members, the direct family members of that Black soldier would also be liberated from slavery. So say if I joined the military, if I were married, my spouse would now be free. So my children, they would be free. So you see how like the freedom started to extend from that military service. And then thirdly, I forgot my third point, whatever. The proclamation did a lot of important things. I forgot my third point, but those two big ones right there kind of make it really, really important and powerful as what the proclamation did. I guess, the third point here is also that the proclamation didn't order that every slave in America was free. It was only the enslaved people in the rebellious states at that point. However, via those first two mechanisms, you start to see slavery kind of crumble and erode even in like the loyal slave states, Kentucky, Maryland, because Union soldiers at that point were like, well, you know what? I'm not trying to decide whether this person is a slave from Virginia that's rebellious or they're from Maryland, which is loyal. We're just going to free this person. We're not going to ask any more questions. Then conversely, if you're a Black soldier from Kentucky and you had once been a slave, now you join up, well, the slave owner in Kentucky, the federal government's overruling them. They say like, okay, this guy's joined, he's free, but so now is his wife and children, no matter what you say. So that's how the proclamation made these inroads against slavery. It didn't completely destroy the system, but you can see how it's just making all these cracks and these fissures that begin just to destroy the system the longer the war went on.
Yeah, yeah. So you note that, while it did, in a way, these are milestone events, right? You have the Confiscation Act, you have the Emancipation Proclamation,
Yeah.
you have Juneteenth. None of them individually mark the end of slavery in the United States. None of them sort of magically end slavery. That's an important point about the history of emancipation in general, that there are many military, political, individual acts that comprise emancipation in what we now know today as the United States. And last year, you shared with me that you did some research to create a brief legal summary of emancipation for the United States. Could you please take us through what you found and what inspired this research project last year as well?
Yeah. So this, growing up in Texas, I got make sure I brought my little flag so people can see. Growing up in Texas, in Galveston County, it's not Galveston, the city, but in the county of Galveston. I grew up there. So Juneteenth was celebrated, and like growing up as a child, it's just like, okay, this is just another like day for us to barbecue in the summer. Like that wasn't all that it was, but as a child, that's like kind of what I viewed it as. So I didn't think of it as anything other people would kind of be into. But then I noticed over the last decade, this isn't like a all-encompassing viewpoint on this situation, but from my vantage point, I started to notice like over the last decade that more and more people became aware of and were celebrating Juneteenth. And I would get more questions on the tour at Lincoln's Cottage about Juneteenth. And then it kind of came to a crescendo last year after George Floyd had been murdered. That was like 3 weeks before Juneteenth. So all of a sudden, a lot of companies and brands and all kinds of folks were just being like, okay, this year we're going to give everybody Juneteenth off, or we're going to honor Black history and all this. And I was just like, okay. It's like, that was just weird that it's just exploded the way it did. But then also was the misunderstanding as to what Juneteenth actually was, because a lot of companies were saying Juneteenth is the day that slavery was ended in the United States. And I'm just like, that is not the story. Like, as we've just been talking about the last few minutes here, like even Juneteenth didn't end slavery in Texas at that moment. Like, it still took weeks and months to actually enforce emancipation in the state. And that's just Texas. So, being the historian that I am, and also I'm a little sarcastic and surly. So I was like, all right, Aaron knows. So I was like, let me look at these individual states, and I knew some of this history already, but let me go through every state that was part of the United States at that point and see their individual history as it related to slavery. And that's what took me from this, this almost 90-year timeline from 1780 to 1865, actually 1866, of this long, lengthy, and just kind of confusing process of emancipation, the legal process of emancipation. And I think that kind of begins to explain why people wanted the easy answer that Juneteenth was the day slavery ended, because the correct answer, if you want to call it that, is that getting rid of slavery took at least 86 years. And that's just the legalized end of it. Again, bringing it back to the personal front, since the first person was brought as a slave to the United States, or what is now the United States, I'm sure they want to be free. So really, as you talk about it, the process of emancipation took 2.5 centuries. So that's why I sat down and started looking at the codes. So stuff like the Northwest Ordinance, which is a federal law covering old Northwest territory, which I'm sure many folks from Illinois would know about that. Things like Massachusetts had a court decision in their state in 1780. It wasn't even a state yet. It was still a colony fighting against the British, but at their state Supreme Court, in a series of decisions, outlawed slavery. The state of Pennsylvania, New York, and New Jersey, and Connecticut, they all did gradual emancipation. So they took, a couple of decades from the 1780s to the early 1800s to abolish slavery. And then places interesting one is California, because California, conquered from Mexico, doesn't even go through a territorial stage, just kind of becomes a state in 1850 via the 1850 Compromise. So technically they were a free state, but they also had a law in their state that said that, well, it's okay to enslave Native Americans. if they're not working, if they're like, basically being vagrants, you could, as a white person, charge them as a vagrant and then basically take them as your slave. So technically California was a free state. They enslaved Native Americans even in the 1850s and 1860s. So there's lots of other little nitty gritty details, but this kind of gives you a sense of just the complexity and kind of the kaleidoscope of emancipation and slavery in the US. And that Juneteenth is an important part of the story, but it's definitely not the beginning, and it's not even the end necessarily of the story of emancipation in the United States.
Well, and you mentioned the enslavement of Indigenous Americans, but then there's also the treaties with Indigenous populations.
Yeah.
And can you talk a little bit about that? Because that was something that's after
Yes.
the 13th Amendment too, correct?
Yeah. So the history of Native American enslavement is also very important, and particularly in New England. A lot of Native Americans up there were enslaved by the Puritan settlers up there in the 1600s. But then in the southern part of the U.S., there was a slave trade in Native Americans as well. But by the late 1700s, early 1800s, some of the Native tribes, like the Cherokee and the Creek, had begun to kind of adopt, if you want to call it that, like adopt some of the systems of the white settlers nearby, which included enslaving African Americans. So when they got put on the Trail of Tears, not only did the Native Americans go to Oklahoma, what is now Oklahoma, their Black slaves also went with them to Oklahoma. So during the Civil War, some of the tribes sided with the Union, some sided with the Confederacy. Well, when the war is over with, the federal government, this is Indian territory. So remember, that's an important stickler. This is Indian territory at that point. Mm-hmm. And so the federal government signs treaties with these Native tribes there, these Native nations. So the 13th Amendment applied to the states and territories of the United States, but there's like some wiggle room on interpretation whether it applied to Indian territory, because that was like, under the laws, it was sovereign territory of the Native nations there. So the federal government had to sign treaties in 1866 to end slavery in Indian territory, what is now Oklahoma. And so that explains why you have, Black Cherokees in that state. And also that explains some of the, not all of, but some of the Black population that was in Tulsa, Oklahoma, when that riot and massacre happened a century ago.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Well, and so, and we have a link, Curtis has generously provided a link to a Google document that shares this sort of legal summary, if you will, and a lot of the dates when important legislation happened in different states and territories and districts, et cetera. And so we'll be providing that link to you all in the chat. And that deals with the legal end of slavery in some of these places, but we also know that legally ending slavery, while that sounds wonderful and is often paired or immediately followed by other legislation that restricts the rights and freedoms of people. What can you tell us about that and that pairing, that there's, on the one hand, you get the emancipation legislation, and then you get these sort of restrictive Black codes a lot of times that are paired right with it.
Yeah, this is something very important. Like, actually, when I taught my class this past semester too, like we started technically with Reconstruction, but we backed up a little bit into the Civil War. And I was telling my students there, and obviously when I gave tours too, that these moves to be anti-slavery did not mean that you were pro-Black. I think it's the simplest way to put it, because a lot of folks were anti-slavery because they were anti-Black. They just thought, get rid of every Black person in the United States, which obviously meant getting rid of slavery at the same time. So in certain parts of the country, like such as Illinois and also Oregon, when they did have anti-slavery legislation, it was also coupled with legislation that said that free Blacks cannot settle in this state. Or if you do settle in the state as a free Black person, you had to post a bond to live in the state. So Ohio had that law where it's like, okay, we're not gonna have slavery, but free Black person, I forget the dollar amount, but let's just say, like, if you settle in our state, you got to pay $50 and basically as like promising that you'll be on good behavior. So yeah, like it costs you money to be free in Ohio, whereas white people in that state did not have to pay the freedom bond, but a free Black person had to pay that money up front to move into the state. So that kind of shows and of course you got a lot of stuff during Reconstruction too, that, that's a whole nother story of these pushes for, greater Black freedom are met with pushback and opposition at the same time that really complicate any idea of a linear upward trajectory that is nonstop toward freedom. There's a lot of push and pull going along the way the whole time.
Yeah. Well, and you mentioned Ohio, and a lot of what we've been talking about here are, sort of sweeping changes, legislative changes, military changes. I grew up in Ohio, and there wasn't an Emancipation Day sort of commemorative date that I remember, but in 2006, there was a group of high school history students under the supervision of a now retired teacher, Paul LaRue, who we worked with in DC. And they got the Ohio State Legislature to declare September 22nd the recognized Emancipation Day back in 2006. And that's the preliminary proclamation day, of course. But those are all sort of the bigger picture, more general things. And it is always important to consider how this impacted individuals. And one that has an Ohio connection that I know you've written about is Lewis Hughes. So can you tell us, please, the story of his road to emancipation?
Yeah, so this guy, I found him randomly because he actually wrote an autobiography, I think sometime in the late 1890s, don't remember the exact year, but Lewis Hughes was from Tennessee, and he, according to him, himself, when he wrote his autobiography, he was enslaved somewhere outside of Memphis. Didn't exactly state precisely where, or I might have missed it, reading the book. But he attempted to get his freedom at least four times. I guess four failed attempts, and then the fifth attempt was finally successful. But he tried four times to get his freedom in Tennessee, and was caught those four times, and then finally the fifth time, which is right after the Civil War ended, he was finally able to get off the plantation and get to Memphis. And he said that, the city of Memphis, was just filled with, the population of Memphis exploded during the war because that city was occupied by the U.S. Army in around April 1862, which is really early in the war. So Memphis was one of those beacons of freedom for Black people in Tennessee, Arkansas, Mississippi, trying to escape to get to that city. So that city's Black population just grew tremendously during the war. Lewis Hughes was one of them after the war, shortly after the war getting there. But his story also shows that, in his own words, he said he escaped from that plantation after the war. So even though at that point, slavery in Tennessee is basically dead, at least by the letter of the law, but the plantation owner still wasn't basically telling people all right, you're free, see you later. He had to kind of, seize his freedom and kind of take that step outwards. And also think about if you're Lewis, you've tried this four times before. Okay, the law says you're free now, but am I really free? Do I really want to try to test the bounds here and set foot off the plantation? It's kind of testing the trap, I guess. But he and his wife, tested it. They found okay, this is real, and they got their way to Memphis. And he learned how to read and write, wrote the autobiography. That's how I know about it. He's a great lesser known example that there are many people like him who have to kind of, again, test the bounds and really wonder whether this freedom was really and actually happening. Yeah.
I'm going to take some questions from the audience now before we continue on. The first one's from Mike McGeever, and he starts out by thanking you and wishing you luck with your dissertation. And I hope everyone in the audience is thinking that, if not writing it out, because we do wish you luck. He notes that the U.S. colored troops played a really pivotal role in turning the tide for the Union Army. What's your sense, Curtis, of how many knew about the Emancipation Proclamation before the Union Army arrived to enforce it? Were there a larger number of escape attempts after the Emancipation Proclamation as formerly enslaved Black individuals tried to join the Union Army, or not? What's your understanding, what's your research and analysis on this?
Yeah, so I would say there's really no hard numbers on that first off. No one was taking there with a clicker and be okay, this is how many people tried to escape today. So all these numbers always kind of fuzzy. The hardest number you got is the number of Black men that joined the U.S. colored troops. That's the only hard and fast number of people who escaped that you really truly know about during the war. Because everything else is really just haphazard, hodgepodge record keeping at the time, if they even tried to keep records. But just as a factor of, as the war progressed, the US Army got deeper and deeper into those slave states, just as a function of that, you would have more and more escape attempts. Because when the war starts, the US Army is, you know, basically at the Ohio and Potomac rivers. So not a lot of escape attempts from, say, like Mississippi or Georgia at that point. But again, as you get to like 1864, the military occupies the Mississippi River Valley. You got Sherman in Tennessee about to make his way into Georgia. Of course, you have the battles in Virginia that, of course, those went back and forth over the preceding 3 years. So, just by those kind of think about it geographically, like just think of like this blue line going further and further into the South. That means that blue line is, first of all, crossing plantations. So even if you didn't try to escape, maybe the Union Army just got to your plantation. So now you're kind of escaped, you're free now because the Army got there. Or as the Army gets closer to you, you now feel a little bit more, a better sense that, okay, I can make this attempt to get free and I have a better chance of success at that point. So I can't give you a number, but just think about it conceptually that kind of factors into that there will be more escapes being made as the war progresses, just by that military progress made by the US Army, which was led quite often in 1864 and 65 by Black soldiers at that point.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. We also have a question from David Kent, notes that he's had the privilege of getting a tour from you several years ago and appreciates seeing you again. And he asked if you know if there are any Juneteenth events happening in the DC area. We've talked about the ones happening in Springfield. DC, of course, celebrates DC Emancipation Day in April of every year. There are still many people who celebrate in churches Watch Night, the New Year's Eve celebration, waiting for the hour. But Juneteenth has had an uptick in recognition in DC in the last decade or so as well. Are you aware of any specific Juneteenth events happening this year in the DC metro area, Curtis?
This year is a bad year to ask me that, because again, I got a big thing to do. It's about 6 weeks. But as you noted, Aaron, it has gained prominence like as it has across the country in the DC area. So I imagine there will be whether in DC proper, which I imagine there will be, but like obviously in surrounding communities, there will be as well. But DC also has DC Emancipation Day in April. So like, that's another good example of this localized Emancipation Day that is completely separate from what happened in the rest of the country. And DC has made that a holiday. And so, DC folks are big on that. So yeah, I'm sorry, I don't have any further details, but I'm trying to get that dissertation finished and defended. So come back and ask me next year, I'll be more up to date on what's on the social calendar.
That's totally fair. And David, I know I've seen tweets from the mayor, from Mayor Bowser about it. And I think that there is a Juneteenth group in DC. I can't remember the name of it off the top of my head, very similar to the one in Springfield. I think they have a website. So let's see, we have, question number 3. You might kill me for this one, Curtis, but it's your lovely mother who is wishing you luck. So there's that. And we also, let's see. So another question from Mike is that he wants to know what your favorite story is, personal, historical, from your time interpreting at President Lincoln's Cottage, or I'll open it up to the National Museum of American History or the National Museum of African American History and Culture as well, because you worked at several institutions in DC. And I think spent most of the time at the cottage out of those 3, but he wants to know, our audience is often very interested in the work of public history in addition to the topic. And so if you have the most interesting story that happened your time interpreting. Or the most interesting question, maybe, that you ever got.
I don't know. That's gonna, oh man. That's, ooh.
You want to mull that for a bit?
Yeah, that's a tough, there's so many questions. You have to like go through the mental Rolodex, like all these questions you get over the years. I guess the question, it kind of got to what you asked me earlier. Was my favorite question that people would ask, or like this form of question, this variety of question, was when people would ask, how did people know about this?
Yeah.
Because like when we would explain the Emancipation Proclamation, and again, some folks kind of took it at face value, like, oh, Lincoln signed it. And then like voila. But then some people kind of sit back and think about, wait a minute, like, how did people actually learn about this? And so that allowed us to get into just the real, it allowed us to transport people as best as you can, like back to the 1860s and consider the world at that point. Because like, you didn't have the cell phone, the telegraph was new, but you didn't have the telegraph on every house did not have a telegraph. So like, it was a really good question just to get people to think more historically, and also get them to think about, okay, well, if you were in that situation as well, like, what would you do about it? Because some folks would kind of be brash about it. This is more students.
Yeah.
High school students, like, be kind of brash, like, oh yeah, I would do this and that. And it's like, well, would you? It's like, of course you want to be free, but like, are you willing to take the chance to be free? Given what could come with that? Because if you fail, you get beat, they might beat your family and other people you knew, as and also if you escaped, the threat was also like, okay, well, you got away, but we can still take it out on the people you left behind on the plantation. So even the threat of that was a way to keep people from trying to escape. So that question of how do people learn about this just opened up all these avenues to kind of explore the mindset of people in the 1860s. And also, not just the folks trying to be free, but also the folks trying to keep their slaves, because that's a harder one to get over too. People just being like, well, everyone thought slavery was bad, right? And like, there's just a few people that thought it was good. And it's like, no, there's a lot of folks that thought slavery was good. It's like, of the 11 states that rebelled and formed the Confederacy, 40% of their population was enslaved. So it's like, you don't enslave 2/5 of an entire country or a region without input or support from a huge chunk of that other 60%.
Yeah,
or at least the
explicit or implicit. Yeah, there's
at least acquiescence. Like, if they're like, hey, maybe I wouldn't have done it, but I'll just sit here and let it go. So like, that's the most charitable interpretation. There's a lot of folks who found it to be good business. So yeah, sorry, long-winded answer, but yeah, that question of how do people get news about this opened up all those other conversations on just the mindset folks had, for better or worse, back in that time period.
Right, and how the information was being shared and what was at stake for all the different populations. Yeah.
And also, the very last thing is, that also allowed me to get across the intelligence of enslaved people, because oftentimes you think of them as passive actors and all this. Because again, we were talking about Lincoln's proclamation. Right. When people would ask like, how they learn about it, I'd be like, oh, great. Let's talk about how these people who owned slaves in the South, they weren't serving themselves at the dinner table. So they would have a slave come up and give them their tea or whatever it was, maybe talking business and all that. And the enslaved person is like, okay, this is some important news. Let me sit here and kind of linger just for a moment longer, get it, and then kind of spread it out to everybody else out on the plantation. So the word of mouth was very powerful, but also just the intelligence and the agency of Black people at that point was also important to put across.
Yeah. A follow-up question to that, and I mean, I think that we could go on this one for a long time, but in your experience, and we have plenty at this point, interpreting this subject with the public, what are the top misconceptions in your experience of emancipation in the United States?
That I think it goes back to the issue with, and I mean issue like in a, not trying to, not like pejorative sense here, but like it's the issue with the Juneteenth celebrations right now, where people are like, it's the day, like people want to have this the moment. It is not specific to Juneteenth either. It's like with like even Independence Day, July 4th. Like I would have, this is how I hammer it home with people. Sometimes I'd be like, all right, history is a process, life is a process, nothing ever just happens. Like there's a buildup, there's maybe like this discrete moment, but there's still like an aftermath as well to this moment. It's like, think about the Declaration of Independence, like, okay, right. I don't even think it was signed on July 4th, but like the specifics on that are also kind of hazy, but whatever. July 4th, we sign it, we celebrate that day, but it's like, we didn't actually get independence until 1783, 7 years later. So it's like, even July 4th celebrations are kind of a celebration of the Declaration of Independence. It's not actually the day we actually achieved our independence from Great Britain, because that took 7 more years of fighting in a peace treaty, the Treaty of Paris, to make that official. So like emancipation kind of follows a similar thing, a similar path, but you just have a lot more documents thrown in there. Like you get the Emancipation Proclamation, the 13th Amendment, all those various state holidays, the DC Emancipation Act. So that's what made it thorny, but also when I was always happy when people kind of realized that history was a process, and it kind of freed them from like, they kind of were liberated from like, oh, I got to know this like precise thing. And like history seems so simple, but they realize, oh, it's complicated, just like the world is today. So,
Right. Yeah.
So that was always great to have folks have that revelation. And I had many people tell me this was much more engaging than my high school history when I went, which like, I don't know what that means for the high school history teacher. Maybe it just meant maturity on that person's part, but they were like, okay, I understand history and I get it much better. Maybe they don't remember all the facts, but they realize that history is a process, and like the world didn't work exactly back then as it does today, but it has a similar complexity back then as it does today.
Well, and to the point you made earlier, it's also not a linear process either. Progress isn't linear. And it's a good point too, because as much as you sometimes see entities, individuals, corporations, individuals saying this is we're celebrating this holiday because it's the day X happened, you raise a great point. A lot of holidays are symbolic, and they are the day we have chosen to celebrate something, but it does not mean that something happened in its totality on that day. It might be a best guess of a date. Religious holidays too, not just political and national holidays. So here's another question that we have, and it comes from Frank Markley, who asks, we hear of reunions of veterans sometimes, including both Confederate and Union soldiers. And he asks, of the various reunions and celebrations or anniversary markings among veteran soldiers in the years following the Civil War, were there any known reunions that included both U.S. colored troops and veteran U.S. colored troops and white veterans at the same anniversary event?
Yes, there's actually a really great book. It's called The One Cause, like one, W-O-N. I think the author I think her name is Barbara Gallagher. I think that's the author of the book. I hadn't read it in a while, but it's a great book.
Barbara Gannon?
Yes, that's
Barbara
it.
Gannon.
Yes. As I do is Barbara, some G last name. I was like, Gallagher? No, Gannon, that's it. The One Cause. But that's her whole book, is talking about the Union soldiers, how the Grand Army of the Republic, the Union Veterans Association, how they were, especially after Reconstruction came to an end, how they were the primary civic organization in the United States that was basically fighting for, outside of Black Americans themselves, like the major, I guess, like integrated organization fighting for the rights of Black people in the United States. And so she documents the reunions and that they would have every year, or the parades every Memorial Day, or Decoration Day as they called it back then. How the Black and white soldiers would march together at these posts, at these parades, I should say. Then the posts that they were part of, the GAR posts, oftentimes were integrated. Sometimes they were segregated, Black and white posts, but then they would celebrate together at these events. And then also, interestingly, within the Southern states, the GAR posts were almost entirely populated by Black veterans of the U.S. Army. So it was almost like these little nuggets of resistance to the rise of Jim Crow in the 1880s and 1890s, with these GAR posts that were populated by Black men. And in Tennessee, there are also, of course, there are a lot of white veterans from Tennessee for the U.S. Army from the Civil War. So those posts also operated in somewhat integrated fashion. But that is a fantastic book that will give you a lot more details on how they interacted with Black and white veterans in the years after. And how the white vets of the Union Army, not all of them obviously, but they more so than regular society, had a greater appreciation for Black Americans, and were doing more than the average white person to try to protect the rights of Black people following the Civil War.
Yeah, thank you so much, Curtis. This is really interesting stuff. And it's interesting how these anniversaries and holidays serve really as an opportunity to take stock of where we are and how far we've come and how far we still need to go in all things, including freedom and rights. So thank you so much for your time, Curtis. Thanks again to our friends from Juneteenth Incorporated and the Illinois State Museum for joining us. I hope you all found this program inspiring, and that the resources we've shared in the chat will help you discover new information about the history of emancipation in your own area. and opportunities to commemorate those anniversaries this year and in the future. Thank you again so much for joining us, Phyllis. I'd like to turn it back over to you.
Sure. Well, thank you again to all of our special guests tonight for the discussion and for closing out our Fourscore Speaker Series in such a fabulous way. Collaboration is always a great thing to enjoy, and I'm sure that everyone in the audience enjoyed it as well. As we noted last week, we are heading into our summer season, and you will notice a short break in our webinar schedule. Keep an eye on our website as well as our emails and our Facebook page for future events, including one that's already scheduled for September 22nd, featuring Larry Werline as Ulysses S. Grant. We encourage you all to enjoy the summer evenings with your family and their friends, but of course, keep learning and reading and sending us ideas for future webinars that you would like to see. When you close out tonight's webinar, you're going to see a short survey. We'd like you to please take a moment to complete the survey, as it helps us to improve our offerings to you and lets us know what you want to see from us in the future. As always, thank you to our members and our volunteers in the audience. You are truly the backbone of our organization. Thank you to everyone who joined us tonight. Have a great summer and good night.